Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're going to continue with our series of YouTube videos to help you improve your chess. I haven't made a video for about a week, but I have a good excuse. I went to the emergency ward twice, first with a kidney stone, and then they sent me home to pass the kidney stone. It got stuck, it got infected. I had to go back in the hospital. What a mess, and very painful. So I guess you'll excuse me for not creating too many videos. All right, so back to our videos. Now this video, the first reaction I get to this video is, I've seen this before. I can turn this video off. I don't need to watch this. This is in every endgame book, every tactics book. This is one of the most famous endgame tactics there is. And my first answer is, well, okay, you're right. But then my second answer is, but I'll bet you that you haven't seen the rest of the story. So yes, we'll start out with the basic stuff, which will take a couple minutes, but then we'll get into the stuff that you probably haven't seen before. So stick around, it might be very interesting. Okay, so this is the famous problem, white to play and win. And it looks like white's in trouble here. White's pawns are on the same rank as the black king. If white tries to run his king over toward the side with the pawns, he's going to continually be cut off, and then black's just going to pick off the pawns and win. So clearly that doesn't work. And if white tries to do something kind of mundane, like push one of his side pawns, then what black wants to do is keep the pawns on the board and play a move like either g6 to lock it up, or pawn takes pawn. And when white takes back, these pawns will again be targets when the black king gets over there first. So even though it's white's move here, even though it's black's moves here, black will bring the king over and come after the pawns and win. So as almost everybody watching this video probably knows, the right thing for white to do is to play the very clever move g6. And now white's threatening to take on both f7 and h7, so black has to take him. And whichever way he takes, there's a trick. And this is a very well-known trick, and not the purpose of the video to teach you, but the trick is, if he takes with the f pawn, then you push the h pawn, threatening to take on g7 and get a queen first. That means black has to take there, but now white pushes with f6 and gets a queen and wins. For instance, something like h5, f7, h4, f8, h3, queen h6, takes the pawn. You know, the rest is easy. We can also use a mirror image of that around the G file. If we put a mirror on the G file, instead of F takes G6, the mirror image of that would be H takes G6. And now the mirror image of the previous push would be to play C6, exact same pattern, just in a mirror. G takes, H6, and white wins. So white is completely winning here. After G6, pawn takes, pawn up, takes here. Just winning very easily. Same thing over and over again. Doesn't matter what he does. If he takes that pawn, you go here. No race here. Pawn up. Queen here. End of ball game. Okay, so why am I showing this video? Because there's a lot more to this than what we're looking at right here. Now the next question I ask people is, how far away does the black king have to be before this would work, and how close does it need to be so it won't work? Well, the answer lies in the line we just gave. To g6, f takes g6, h6, g takes h6, pawn here. If we use the principle of the square, which is to create a square, you draw a square from the pawn to the promotion square, and then an exact square in the direction of the defending king, the black king needs to enter into this square in order to save the day, which means the black king needs to be on c5 or closer for this not to work. All right, so when you see this famous problem, we can pretty much guarantee the king is not on c5 or closer. Oh, by the way, I guess I should show you, this same trick doesn't work if the pawns are all back a rank. Now the white pawns are too far away from queening to make it work. So let's do it here. Suppose white tries g5 here, And black plays f takes g5, and if white tries h5, black can take, and if white pushes the pawn, black says, oh, you want to go into this endgame here where you're down a couple pawns, huh? White gets queen, black gets queen, and now white has to worry about whether he can get some sort of perpetual check here, because this is an unpleasant endgame. So here playing g5 doesn't work. White's pawns have to have a complete space advantage over the black pawns to be on the 5th rank against the 7th for the trick to work. All right, now we're ready for the interesting part of the video. So we've gone through the stuff that everybody knows and people say, why am I watching this video? And now we're going to look at what happens if we put the black king close enough to get into the square. Okay, so now we know if we put the kings on the C file and get rid of the kings on the A file, that if we play g6, which way does black have to take? If you're not sure of this, take your time and figure it out. Black to play and make the trick not work. Well, the answer is h takes g6 is triple question mark, then f6, pawn takes, h6, and the king can't stop it. So that's the wrong way. When white plays g6, black has to play f takes, and if white plays h6 and pawn takes and pawn here, black says, oh good, I'm inside the square, picks up this pawn and wins with king and 3 pawns against king and 0. So now we're going to ask the interesting question. What is the outcome of this position? If it's white's move and both sides play perfectly, what should happen? This is not very often talked about in any books or any videos, and it leads to some very, very interesting endgame play. All right, so for instance, if white does nothing and he just starts to run over because he can't, push the pawn like he could, clearly he's just going to lose like we looked at before. If he just does nothing, the black king is closer to the pawns. So white needs to do something, but what can he do? Well, he could still try pushing the pawns and doing some different things. And the thing that he's trying to avoid is getting into positions where the pawns are still sitting ducks. For instance, suppose he plays h6. What should black do? Well, the easiest thing for black to do here is just take the pawn, and now clearly g6 doesn't work anymore. White doesn't have enough guard on it. And if white takes back, then again the king will come across, the pawns are a sitting duck. So if black's smart enough to do that, then black can win. But suppose black plays a move like g6. What should white do? Well, white clearly wants to get pawns off the board. If he plays pawn takes pawn though, he's got a problem. Again, what can he do? He's got to move the king. If he moves the king away and the black king comes running in like this, trailing behind, it's going to be lost. So, if h6, and if black makes a mistake and plays here, well, what white should do is actually play f6. Now that looks like it loses also, because it's black's turn and he's going to come over and take this pawn. How can this possibly work? Can you figure out how white might save the game here? It's pretty interesting. The right answer is he has to bring his king to the left. King to b4 exclamation point. Why? Well, king e5, king c5. And now black's the one who's in some trouble. He's in a little bit of zugzwang here. If he plays king f5, white's going to head his king right for that f7 pawn. King here, king takes, king here. Let's say king takes, g5, king e6, g4, f7. If king g7, king e7, and white's winning. So black can actually lose if he plays it wrong. Let's say white pushes the f pawn instead of the h pawn. Again, black should just take. If he plays here, then white has several choices. He can try the same trick again and play h6. And now again, if king here, white has to know going away from the pawns is the way to save the game. Let's say he plays here. Now what should black do now? Well, what black should do is not go after the g5 pawn, because if he lets white win the f7 pawn, he's going to lose the game. So what black should do is just keep blocking the white king. Every time the white king moves on the b file, black just keeps blocking him. And black says, I know I'm closer to the pawns, but if I go after them, I'm going to lose. So just keep the king on the d file here. Let's say black doesn't do that. Let's say black says, well, maybe I can go over to here now. Well, after king here, he can't block anymore, because after here, he can't get to the e7 square. And he's forced to go up to the 5th rank. And now white's going to win, like we just saw in the previous example. He doesn't have to take that pawn. It doesn't matter. He can move over this way. King takes, pawn here. King e6, pawn here, pawn here, pawn here, pawn queens. If pawn here, then simply something like queen here, king here, queen here. This is what I call the go to sleep position. White can pretty much go to sleep. If black just sits here and guards the pawn, white can pick off the h7 pawn and win. And if black tries to go back after this pawn, white can still pick off the h7 pawn with his king and win. Like so. So, excuse me. So we can see that if white plays c6, black should take the pawn if he wants to win. But what about that move g6? What should he do there? Is g6 now a losing move? Well, if white tries the trick it is, we've already seen this earlier in the video. If f takes g, h6, pawn takes pawn here. But that's not forced. Suppose white plays g6 and black plays takes. White could still take back either way. And believe it or not, the easiest draw here is to play this move. H takes g6. Well, what does that do? Well, it threatens to play g takes h7. If black now starts a race with h5, white says, I'm going to win that race with f6, a pseudo-sacrifice. And whether black takes the pawn or not, white's going to come down and get a queen. Queen first, h2, queen on the h-file, bye-bye ball game. So after g6, f takes g6. If white plays h takes g6, let's say black plays pawn takes and white plays pawn takes. But now that pawn is a goner. And this is an important position that everybody should know about. And I call this position the dance around position. And you might say, the dance around position? What in the heck is a dance around position? And I teach all my students these king and pawn endgames. I go, this is a dance around position. And they're like, what do you mean? Well, what's going to happen here? This is a very, very famous position. And there's lots of positions like this where the two pawns are up against each other. Black's going to come over and try to win the pawn. And now white has to ask himself, if I get into a king and pawn against king and pawn endgame, where do I want to be? And the answer is, you want to be on any square that touches g4 until black takes the pawn. So suppose white plays king f3 here. And black realizes, oh my goodness, if I take that pawn, white's going to get the opposition and draw that endgame. So now black tries to trick white and play like king to g5. This is what I would do if I was playing someone who didn't know what they were doing. And now white plays king g3, and now I would play king h6. This gives them a chance to go wrong, because white has to know he must not put the king on g4 square. Let's show you what would happen if he does. King takes g4, king takes g6, and now we have that famous position where there's a non-rook pawn, and the king is directly in front of the pawn on the same file, and the king is opposing it. And this is the famous opposition case. Whoever move it is gets what they want. Well, white's the one without the pawn, so white wants a draw, and black's the one with the pawn, so black wants the win. Whoever's move it is not going to get what they want. The person whose move it is not is going to get what they want. Well, it's white's move, so it's black's opposition. If it's white's move, black's going to get what he wants with the opposition. He's going to win. White's going to move the king away. Black's going to come up. make progress. If he just keeps the opposition, he's not making any progress. White tries to go here. Black reestablishes the opposition. White goes to the side. Black makes progress. Now if white tries to come up, black pushes the pawn, but not to the same rank as the king. That would be a mistake. For instance, here, you do not want to push the pawn, because then if king g2 is a draw, use the rule that do not push the pawn equal to the king in ranks unless you're 100% sure you're getting a queen. Well, here you're not. So the right move is king f3, then king h2, and now king f2 is a mistake because black will have to repeat the position after king h3. So the right move is to play g4, and after g4, king g1, then king g3, and white has to move out of the way. If he moves to h1, black has two moves that look like they make progress. It turns out king f3 is a mistake. White can now play king to h2, and after king f2, king h1, black can't push the pawn. So when there's a knight pawn, the right way for black to do it is move the king to the outside, king g1, push the pawn. Let's see, did I make the mistake? King g1, push the pawn, king h1. I made the mistake. Ha, how do you like that? So king h2, g4, king g1, king g3. So if king h1, then king h3 is the only way to do it. Then king g1, okay, let's see. King g1, king g3, king h1. Oh, now you can play king f2 because king h2, g3 is check. Well, that's a little embarrassing. All right, so I teach this a million times, but I'm giving the video and I'm not thinking, I'm just making moves. All right, so if you get to this, you can see it's tricky. So king f3, king g4, king g1, king g3, king h1. In this position, you can play king to f2 here. The position I was thinking about was the position where the king's on g1 and it's black's move. If it's white's move, it's easy. You just play king f2 and you'll get the check. Okay, so let's go through that again. g6, f takes g6, h takes g6, h takes g6, f takes. And now let's say black wants to give white a chance to go wrong and go to the wrong square. So he comes back, white goes here, black goes here, white goes here, black goes here, and let's say white goes f3. If he goes f4, black would pretty much have to take the pawn right away. But here black's going to fool around, and now white should not go to this square. If he does, we'll do this right this time. King h4, king f5. King here, reestablish, king here, pawn, king here, pawn up, king here, cannot push the pawn, king here, pawn pushes. Let's say king h1, king g3, king g1. Now this is the opposite of what I just showed you that I messed up. Here, you have to play king h3. If it's white's move and he plays king h1, king f2 will win. But I thought I was in this position. But here you have to play king h3. If you play king f3, then king h2. So king h3 is the only move to make progress. King f3 wins, but only if you admit your mistake. For instance, if you play king f3 and he plays king h2, and you play king f2 and he plays king h1 and you push the pawn, it's stalemate. So you have to play king g3, king g1 and say, oops, sorry, I should have played king h1, king h3, king h1, g3, king g1, g2, king f2, king up. Okay, so what should white do? g6, f takes g6, h takes g6, h takes g6, f takes g6. And let's say king here, king here, king here, king here, king f3, and now black plays king f6. It's good to let white try to make a mistake. If you take the pawn, white might accidentally stumble into the opposition. So what you should do is purposely play king here. Both moves are draws. You want to give your opponent a chance to go wrong. And here white has to dance around this square. He needs to go to a square that goes to g4 on the next move or attacks g4, but not occupy it until black takes the pawn. So white wants to dance around. Let's say he plays king g3. And let's say black dances around and plays king here. And white dances around and plays king here, and black dances around and plays king here. Again, white needs to go to a square that touches g4 but is not g4. He has to dance around g4. King takes, king here. And now that we have the famous draw where white has the opposition. King here, king here, king here, king here, king here, king here. Eventually black realizes, oh, I better push the pawn or else it's threefold repetition. And now we get the famous position where the king is not in front of the pawn, in which case white needs to follow two rules. Rule number one, don't let the black king in front of the pawn. Rule number two, when the pawn gets to the 6th rank, go straight back on the same file. So right here, white has several moves. It doesn't really matter what he does. He draws on all those moves. So let's say he plays here, and let's say black plays here, then white has to not let him in front and play here. Let's say black plays here, and white plays here, and black plays here. Well, white has 4 moves. A lot of people teach here, you have to go straight back. Well, you don't have to go straight back. You can go straight back. Straight back is a good move, but so is king h3, so is king f3. The only move that loses is to play king h5 and let them play king f5. So let's show you that going diagonal doesn't hurt. King here, pawn here. This is not the opposition. The kings are 1 square apart, but there's a pawn on the same rank with the king, and that makes all the difference in the world. Here it's white's move, but he's in no trouble at all. He plays king g3. If black wants to make progress, eventually he has to king push the pawn. And again, there's 4 moves. This is the only one that loses. So king h2, not a bad move. King f2, not a bad move. Black goes here. This is not the opposition. It's white's move. White plays king g2. Don't let the king in front of the pawn. If he doesn't go in front of the pawn, you just keep stepping up. And now again, you can go any way you want, really. Keep going here. Now when he goes here, now it does make a difference. Now the tempos are wrong to go diagonal. If I go diagonal and black comes up and I go here and he pushes, it's white's turn. He's in Zugzwang. He has to go up and he loses the game that he was easily drawing. So the rule is when the pawn's on the 6th rank, now you have to go straight back. And now the tempos are on your side. If he pushes the pawn, stalemate. Okay, so back to our original position. g6, pawn takes. If white takes here, if black takes, we just saw it's a draw. What if black says, I want as many pawns on the board, I want to try to win. I want to play h6. So it's white to play and draw. What should he do? Well, he could take 1 step toward the pawns, but at this point, he's got to be very careful. It looks like he's just going to lose. Black's going to take off that pawns. At this point, let's ask the computer, how many moves can white play and draw? And the computer says, yep, you could still draw with king f3, king f5, but now you're in your last resort. If you want to draw, you have to go to the outside, and that looks counterproductive. Why would he want to go away from the pawns? But the idea is king e3, king g5, king e4, only drawing move, king takes h5, king f5, king here. Now, I've actually saw an expert in time trouble against a master once get to a position like this, and he quickly played king f4, figuring I'll just keep that king in the corner and I'll draw. But king f4 is a monumental blunder because black simply, the master actually kind of smiled at him and pushed the pawn, and all of a sudden white realized, Oh my goodness, what did I do? I can't keep blocking the king in. I have to move out of the way, and now I just wasted a tempo and I'm losing the game. If king f5, king g3, king e6, h4, king f7, h3, king takes g7, h2, king to f7, h1 queen, pawn up, and now we have a famous winning position. I don't want to explain to you how to do this. It's outside the scope of our video, but the queen can beat a knight pawn on the 7th rank, even when the king's relatively far away like this. So this is a loss. So pawn up, pawn takes, h6, king d3, king here, king e3, king e5. And now king f3, king f5, and this is the key point. You can no longer keep going to the right. You have to go to the left. King g5, king e4, king takes, king here, and now we just saw that king f4 loses. The right way to do it is go after the g pawn. King g3, king g f7, h5, king g7. Now white's a tempo ahead of that other line. Pawn up, white gets queen. Black says, yeah, what you going to do about it? Black's still got to be careful. If he goes to the wrong square, every other square loses. For instance, if he goes to h3, the winning move is to keep him away from these two squares. Go to a square that attacks both of those. Queen a8. You can learn a lot from these positions. So the only drawing move for black here is king here. And now if a move like queen a8, you just play king g1, threatening to get a queen, and you get your draw. So in this position, even though it's white to play and he's in some trouble, white can draw with a variety of moves. But we saw if he plays h6, black takes, black wins. If he runs too far over, he just loses. So the easiest way to play is pawn up, pawn takes, and now take this way. If you take the other way, then you have to know all these tricks on how to draw. This is still a draw, but it's tricky. So what you do is you take this way, and now he can't play h5 because f6 wins. So he has to play here, and now you do the dance around, and you get your draw, even if running it off really fast, I got my tempos reversed and played the wrong way. Again, knight pawns are the ones where it's a little bit tricky. You got to go to the right squares. With the center pawns and the bishop pawns, it's like you don't even have to think. Okay, so that's it. So king and 3 pawns against king and 3 pawns, except for that little faux pas in the middle there with trying to queen the knight pawn. I think everything went pretty nicely. And you can say, hey, Dan had a bad day. He's a little rusty from having been in the hospital. And that has nothing to do with it, of course, but I'll take the excuse. All right, hopefully you enjoyed today's video. Hopefully you learned a lot. Hopefully you learned there's a lot more to the king and 3 pawns against king and 3 pawns, especially when the kings are a little bit closer. I think hopefully you enjoyed it. For our video YouTube series, this is Dan Heisman. If you enjoyed it, subscribe. See you next time. Bye.